In this section, we're going to be going a little bit deeper into spaced repetition, and we're going to be focusing on the good and the bad. So, what is great about spaced repetition? Why is it so important? I already talked about how much you forget even after a short period of time. Mentioned briefly memorizing people's names. A lot of people don't realize you hear somebody's name, you can forget it within 5 seconds. So, spaced repetition can even mean the space of 5 seconds or 30 seconds or a minute. So, while you're in a conversation with somebody, if the subject changes, somebody else starts talking, or you just have a few seconds, you can ask yourself, what's that person's name again? Oh, it was Tina. Okay, continue, carry on. Do that, and then be like, okay, where do they work again? What's their role again? What's their title? And then just quiz yourself, ask those quick, rapid fire questions, get the response, and that's going to help build your short-term memory. So spaced repetition doesn't have to be days, weeks, months, years. It can also be seconds and minutes. So this is the kind of stuff you can be doing mid-conversation when there's a lull or there's a break or the other person's talking. You can be getting these spaced repetitions. So one of the great things about spaced repetition is that it's easier than some of these other methods. You don't have to figure out how to use your imagination. You don't have to figure out a new language. You can just do reps, and you can do these reps while you're doing other things. So while you're driving, while you're exercising, while you're cooking, while you're relaxing. I like to do outside work to kind of get my work outside, like digging stuff, working in my garden, cutting wood for the winter, different stuff like that. And so I really enjoy listening stuff. We just got a huge snowstorm here in Boston over the last few weeks, and so I've been doing a lot of shoveling, snow blowing, stuff like that, roof raking. And so I love to listen to get in reps and listen to audio while I'm doing that. So whenever you have some downtime where maybe you can't look at something, but you can listen to something and just put your earbuds in, that's a huge opportunity to get repetitions. So this is something especially like before bed or when you're falling asleep. I like to have something on when I'm if I'm going to sleep, I can listen to something. And so that can be an audio book, that can be an audio that you recorded. We'll be talking more about that stuff later, but anytime you have some downtime, you can do something like that. And it's a huge benefit over doing nothing. So a lot of times in other memory course, but also in this course, you're going to hear about what is the ideal way to do things, what happens if you don't do anything, and what's missing a lot of times, but what you're going to get here is what to do that maybe isn't if everything is ideal, but what's something that's going to work, is going to get you 80 or 90% of the results, but it's a lot easier to do and can work within your schedule, your time frame, and most of you are busy in whatever you're doing, so you don't have a ton of free time to implement something new. So I've simplified things to make it so it's a lot easier to implement and get started. And there's always going to be friction when you get started. It's always going to be hardest to do when you're just getting started. So cut yourself a lot of slack in the beginning. Just make sure you're creating at least one or two habits all the time. So if all that you get out of this course is that you create one new habit to maybe review things on a certain day each week, that's great. And that could go for weeks or months being your only habit. And then once that habit is really locked in, then you can think about, okay, how do I take this to the next level? How do I add something else to this? So make sure that you know ahead of time how much time you have, how much energy you have to put into this course. And then if something seems too complicated, then put it off for later, and just make sure you're forming at least one or two new habits so that those things lock in, and then over time you can add more and more to your system. Because if you try to do everything at once, it's going to be too hard, too complex. Unless you have a really big block of time that you can just focus on doing this, then it's going to have to be something over time. That's why it's a great idea to set a certain day each week where you're going to do your reviews or your repetitions, and also plan out how you can improve your repetitions and your review system. So there's a lot of benefits to doing spaced repetitions. It's also how I got started in memory. It's the basis of Super Memo, which is basically the king of reviewing things. It can review websites, it can review documents, it can review pictures, it can review YouTube videos. So it's really powerful, and you should check it out even if you're not going to use it, because you can see the potential of somebody who's really used spaced repetitions for literally over a decade and see what point it's taken them to and how much they've developed that. It's really amazing to see. It's really impressive how what he's been able to do with that software. So now let's talk about the negative. Part of it, I already mentioned, false sense of knowledge. So you feel like you know more than you actually know because you're not getting quizzed. So we're going to be talking about more of that with space reconstruction. Another thing, and I noticed this a few years ago when I'd have these quotes and these sayings that I would look at every morning, and eventually I realized I'm not actually getting anything out of this. I'm seeing the same thing every day, and my brain doesn't want to look at it anymore. It's ignoring it. It's not relevant. It's too much. It's too often. So another thing is, as you see something more and more, you're going to start skimming over it. And part of that is a good thing. When you're skimming too much, part of what that means is you're reviewing it too often. So that can be a signal that you're looking at things too much and your cycle is wrong, or you put it in the wrong cycle. So you just need to change that. But the biggest thing is scheduling things and getting your information into that scheduling system. So that's the major flaw of SuperMemo, is that you have to get your information into SuperMemo, and then your information has to stay there, and basically everything you do has to be within SuperMemo. And if you make any changes anywhere else, then you're going to have to re-import that information. So part of the problem is that it traps you inside SuperMemo, meaning how are you going to do stuff on your phone? How are you going to do stuff if it's printed out and it's not even in your computer? Or what if you read a book and then you annotated it? What happens next? How does that get into SuperMemo? What if you have a 200 or 300 page book that even if you scan that in, how would that work with SuperMemo? It's not really an efficient way to get repetitions anyways, to be looking at annotated book pages. It really has to be in more in-depth, more consolidated outline or mind map or something else. So one of the big issues is who wants to be staring at a screen hours at a time just doing spaced repetitions on stuff, especially when there's so many things distracting, wanting to go on the internet, browse around, look something up. There's all these distractions on our computers. So that's why I do most of my repetitions offline. But I built a system that you can use whether you want to use it online or offline, and you're also not going to have to transfer any material over to a program like SuperMemo or something else. You can use whatever software you've already got that you're already using, and it'll work with that. And it's the same thing whether it's online or offline. So it's a simplified model. And the other thing is that there's these ideal numbers of, well, you should get your review at exactly this day and exactly that day. Part of the problem with this is that these numbers are kind of averages of different types of information. So memorizing a piece of vocabulary from some foreign language is not going to be the same as memorizing a business concept. And if you understand English and you're trying to learn Spanish or another Romance language, that's going to be a lot easier than learning some language with a completely different alphabet or a completely different system, or a language that has a tonal system, and that's something that you've never used before. So even within different languages, there's going to be a different level of repetition that you need, and there's going to be all these other systems underlying those pieces of information where if you understand those systems, it'll be easier to learn with the flashcards. If not, it'll be harder. So even within different domains of knowledge, or even within just different languages that you might be learning, there's going to be different things that there's going to be a different sequence. There's going to be a need for more or fewer numbers of repetitions, or more or less frequency. So any number that you see in any graph saying the perfect amount of days is this many days between repetitions, that there's no real accuracy there. That may be based on one study, on one type of information, on one type of individual with a certain existing set of knowledge. So it doesn't really apply to you. Ultimately, what you need to understand and what you need to train and learn for yourself is develop an intuition for when should I look at this next? And that's going to happen over time. And it doesn't have to be an exact number of days, because even within let's say a certain set of flashcards, there's different ones that are going to need repetition at a different amount of time. And creating flashcards is usually not an efficient way to memorize information, because it takes a ton of time to create a great set of flashcards, and you could be spending that time doing repetitions in other ways. And a lot of us, we just don't have the time or the energy to be doing that. So even if it is a good option or it's an ideal way to learn, it doesn't mean it's practical for most of us. So for certain situations, especially if you can get pre-made flashcards, that's great. And for certain situations where you maybe need to learn something really perfectly or really exactly, and you don't want to use visual mnemonics for whatever reason, then flashcards can be a good idea. But a lot of times, visual mnemonics is going to be better than flashcards, or you can even combine the two. So we'll talk more about that later, but one of the biggest problems with spaced repetition is how you organize your knowledge and your information so that you can get the spaced repetitions. How do you know after you read something, what do you do so that you know in a week from now you're going to look at again, or 2 months from now, how are you going to remember to even look at that again? So all of that needs a meta system for you to remember to review it. And that's what you're going to learn how to build and learn how to operate later in this course.